And everyone seems to have the same problem, right? They think they have an execution problem. They think they need to be moving faster or things are moving too slow. But to me, fundamentally, they have an alignment problem. And the research backs that up, right? I think there's HBR research from a few years ago, but it still, feels true that 95% of employees can't articulate their company strategy. And the real kicker is when I go into organizations, I tend to ask not just the teams what they think the strategy is, but executives as well. And what surprises me every time is how different the answers are that I get back. And so the decision stack is really a mental model. It's not meant to be like a strict framework, but it connects these kind of 5 core questions that every organization or every team needs to answer. It's where are we going? How are we going to get there? What's important right now on that journey? What actions are we taking to move forward? And then how do we choose between those actions? Now, I answer those questions using vision, strategy, objectives, opportunities, and principles. But the point I'm trying to make is I don't kind of care how you answer the questions as long as you have answers to those. So some people like other tools and OKRs. That's fine. I'm not strictly about those. But as long as you answer that question for your teams.
Hi, Martin.
Hey, Brett. How you doing?
Yeah, good. Thank you so much for joining me to speak today. We are only a few weeks out from our third edition of Weave, which is, for those who don't know, our event for product and technology leaders. So I wanted to preview some of the things that we might be covering at that session where you're speaking. The topic of the event is the age of software abundance, meaning that we're in a time where the cost of development is falling and becoming faster and faster to build new things. That poses lots of big questions about what we build and how we build. And so there's lots to cover. And I know you've been thinking a lot about some of those questions. So yeah, excited to get some of your perspectives. But before I dive in, I wanted to zoom out a little bit. You've been through a few big shifts in the industry over the years. And through Product Tank and Mind the Product, you helped shape the discipline of product management. When did you first realize that that role was becoming a mainstream thing?
I think it probably took me a while, to be honest. I think, when I started Product Tank, it was just me and 20 people in the back room of a pub here in London, and that's kind of all I ever wanted it to be. I just wanted to be able to chat to other product people. But I obviously wasn't the only one who felt that need, so it kind of grew from there. And I think the aha moment for me was probably one of two things. Probably either when we ran our first Mind the Product conference and we had about 450 people show up, or I think related to that, a few years later, we finally took the conference to San Francisco and we sold out 700 seats in minutes. Like it was like we were selling Glastonbury tickets or something. And we kind of realized like, oh yeah, no, this is a bit more mainstream than we thought, and it's growing, and it's a bigger conversation than maybe it had started.
Amazing. And you've said over the years that being a PM is about being experienced in one of business, UX, or tech, but being passionate about all three of those. When did that kind of crystallize for you?
That I think I was a little lucky to be kind of realize early, right? I think I started my career mid 90s as a web designer, and as much as anybody was a web developer at the time, some simple HTML and CGI scripts, but started my career as a designer developer, and very quickly realized in kind of my first couple startups in Sweden in the mid to late 90s that my real superpower was kind of the translation between them and with the rest of the organization, right? I hesitate to say the business, but that kind of cross-functional communication and alignment. I didn't know that was a thing called product at the time, but I learned that skill set very early, and I had job titles like website manager or web manager and things like that towards the end of the 90s. And it wasn't until 1999 I first joined Monster here in London that I learned that that was product management, and had my own aha moment of like, oh, there is a whole like job around this. There is a whole skill set around this. But that connection between business, technology, design, I think I learned quite early.
Yeah, fascinating. So jumping forward a couple of decades then, there's a lot of noise today about AI and other things, and a lot of scaremongering and panic in the organizations that I think both of us interact with. You work with and advise lots of different companies, from scale-ups to some of the world's largest enterprises. In your opinion, what's actually broken? And I don't mean kind of the surface stuff. I mean the things that when you walk into a company you think, oh, there's that problem again. And as a bit of a follow up, how's that changing, and what have you seen change over the last 18 months?
So I think this will become a bit of a theme for our conversation today, but it's really strategy. I find so often I come into organizations to solve a product problem. You know, they pull me in to like help them with the product roadmap or help them with the product prioritization, or we're not shipping fast enough, or, you know, a lot of these symptoms that to them mean they have a product problem or an execution problem. And as soon as I join, it very quickly becomes clear that they have a strategy problem. They haven't made the tough choices. They haven't made the clarity necessary for their teams to execute. And I think that's only becoming more acute, right? So what's changed over the last 18 months is we're moving faster and faster. AI is allowing us to move really fast. A lot of incumbents are being threatened by AI in different ways, whether it's traffic or, you know, core product features being built by startups that are threatening them. And they're probably not rethinking that strategy enough, right? I think it all comes back to that point for me of really knowing what you're doing and why you're doing it. Comes back to clear strategy. So that is what I find most organizations struggle with, and where I frankly have a lot of fun helping them try to figure that out, because that then unlocks the product team, that unlocks the dev team, that unlocks everyone, and can kind of move forward quickly again.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you talked about the speed at which things are changing and the speed at which organizations are able to change. That's causing kind of challenges in a number of ways. Some people are adapting at incredible pace to that reality and others aren't. Are you seeing people having kind of not necessarily having the right strategy, or are you seeing people with outdated strategy, or in some cases, I guess, kind of too much of what they might call strategy?
Yeah, I think what I see a lot of is probably what I would call strategy theater, right? So there's a lot of like, oh, we're doing a strategy offsite, and oh, we have this, you know, we have a plan. And again, I think to some extent it's correct that the longer a business has been around and the more established a product is, the longer that strategic view can be, right? You can have a 3 or 5 year or even 10-year strategy if you've been around that long. If you're a startup, it is by nature much shorter. But I think the challenge is most organizations kind of wait until the end of that 3-year period or 5-year period to reassess. And especially when something comes along like AI that upturns every assumption about our product, our business, our customers, our market, we have to be able to just start all over again. And so maybe that's the biggest thing I see, is that strategy has to be much more of a living document and not a kind of one and done, set and forget kind of thing. And so that's where a lot of organizations think they have strategy because they did that offsite last year or 2 years ago, but it's not actually serving their team or serving their organization, and therefore it's not actually helping them move forward.
Yeah, got it. I think we definitely see that that problem manifesting in a number of the organisations we work with too. You said strategy and principles are two of the layers that are most often missing. I'm sort of leaping forward a little bit here to preview some of what's in the book. Why do you think it's those two most commonly?
I think they're related to each other, right? And they kind of reflect each other. And I think that the challenge with good strategy and good principles is that you fundamentally have to start making some tough choices. And people really don't like reducing optionality. And it depends on the organization. Sometimes that's because, making choices comes with risk, right? And therefore you might feel like your job's at risk because you made a tough choice that may or may not work. You're reducing that optionality. And it's just these things that we're really uncomfortable with. So I think the more that we can open that up, have different conversations about this, there's lots of writing about this that smarter people than I have done around thinking in bets, for example, by Annie Duke. And, we talk in product much more about hypothesis driven testing or assumptions and things like that. I think the more we can talk about it in that, the more it opens up that conversation. But I think that's why it's so hard for people to really do great strategy and principles, is because fundamentally you have to start making some choices about, who's your market, how are you, where are you going to play, how are you going to win? Like these classic questions, they come with tough choices. And we're never going to have perfect enough information to be, 100% confident in these choices either. Like you have to be happy to operate on 70% confidence or less sometimes to make that bet, to make that move forward and bring the organization with you. So I think that's why a lot of organizations struggle and they end up with, a do everything strategy that kind of spreads everyone thin and just, makes everyone move slowly or trying to chase too many targets, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's why those two are most often missing. But it doesn't mean that you can't resolve it, right?
Yeah, right. And it's very tempting to do everything when it looks like it's becoming cheaper and cheaper to do everything, but you don't necessarily account for the costs of trying to do everything.
Yeah,
Um, Great. So you've been thinking about this a lot over the last couple of years, and
yeah.
you've written a new book, which is on its way. Is it April when it's going to land?
Yeah, I'm hoping early April, but these timelines are not entirely in my control, so mid-April maybe.
Not like shipping a digital product, eh? I'd love to understand the book properly. Walk me through it. What is the decision stack, and why does it matter?
Yeah, so I think we've touched on it a little bit, right? I think every organization I've worked with, especially over the last 10 years, I've advised on nearly 150 portfolio companies at EQT and coached product leaders beyond that. And everyone seems to have the same problem, right? They think they have an execution problem. They think they need to be moving faster or things are moving too slow. But to me, fundamentally, they have an alignment problem. And the research backs that up, right? I think there's HBR research from a few years ago, but it still feels true that 95% of employees can't articulate their company strategy. And the real kicker is when I go into organizations, I tend to ask not just the teams what they think the strategy is, but executives as well. And what surprises me every time is how different the answers are that I get back. And so the decision stack is really a mental model. It's not meant to be like a strict framework. But it connects these kind of 5 core questions that every organization or every team needs to answer. It's where are we going? How are we going to get there? What's important right now on that journey? What actions are we taking to move forward? And then how do we choose between those actions? Now, I answer those questions using vision, strategy, objectives, opportunities, and principles. But the point I'm trying to make is I don't kind of care how you answer the questions as long as you have answers to those. So some people like other tools and OKRs. That's fine. I'm not strictly about those. But as long as you answer that question for your teams. And the other important thing is that these all connect, right? Every level has to flow into the next level. And that's not just from the top down, so kind of asking the how question, how are we going to achieve this vision? Here's our strategy and so on, but also from the bottom up. So any individual on your team or in your organization should be able to ask a question why this piece of work matters and see how it connects up to their objectives, up to their strategy, up to their vision. And it's only by having those connections that these things actually work. And most companies have something at each of these levels that they can definitely be improved, and I do go through a bit of that in the book. But fundamentally, the biggest thing that is missing is that connection piece. And I think when it works, it is transformative, right? I've been lucky enough to work through this with quite a few teams. As one CPO kind of put it, it cuts through the noise and connects high-level strategy to day-to-day decisions. I'm lucky enough to have Marty Kagan say it's the strategic context that empowered teams depend on. And I've had founders tell me that they kind of wish they had this 5 years ago before they'd even started this journey, right? So really, to put it simply, it's that stack of decisions that every organization makes. And the more clear that stack is, the easier it is to make decisions at any level of that stack. So teams stop waiting for permission. They start making decisions that are theirs to make. And that's what results in true velocity, not just speed. And I love the scientific distinction there because speed is really just has no direction, whereas velocity is speed plus a direction. So we're moving fast in the right direction for the organization. And I think that's the piece that's missing for most.
Amazing. What I'd love to do next is dive into some of the layers of the stack itself. So you talked a bit about vision there.
Yeah.
How do you know when a vision is actually good versus just kind of the aspirational fluff that we've seen a lot over the years?
I think the easiest answer to that is, does it actually help you make decisions? Like, does your vision articulate something that's clear enough to tell everyone on the team, like, oh, we're doing this, not this? I think another good symptom of a good vision is that it's actually about the customer or the market and the change you're trying to see in the world, as opposed to you as a business, right? I think some of the worst visions are the ones that are, to be the leading/best provider, fill in the blanks, because it doesn't really tell you anything about what you're trying to do or why that's important.
Yeah, great. Have you got any really bad horror stories of vision statements in mind?
I think as I've been doing the research, I mean, I've seen bad ones. I've written bad ones myself in my career, but I think the worst one I know right now is And actually, I'll say the vision, then I'll let you guess if you can figure out what company it is. So, the vision is to enable people and businesses throughout the world to realize their full potential.
God, that could be so
Could
many boring
could be
corporates, couldn't it?
anyone, right?
Uh, is it some sort of consulting firm? Because they're the worst culprits for
It
this.
it is actually Microsoft.
Oh, it's terrible, isn't it?
But to your point, it could have been anyone, right? It could mean anything. It means everything to everyone. Like it's not helping anyone at Microsoft make decisions or decide like this is what we're trying to do. This is our customer. They used to have a fantastic one. They used to have one of my favorites. It used to be a computer on every desk and in every home. And I think that, that wasn't talking about my software, wasn't talking about the things they built, but it was still an aspirational goal. And then I think maybe to, build it back to all the different things that they're doing now, it just went so broad that it kind of has lost all meaning instead.
Yes, it's a real shame that, isn't it? Great. So vision feels clear to me. On strategy, we've touched on it a little bit, but what's the most common mistake that you see leaders making when they're thinking about strategy?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, we've touched on this, right? It's choices. It's really just making choices. A lot of the great strategy thinkers before me have defined this, right. It's about making choices. It's about differentiating yourself. That's how Michael Porter puts it. You can look at Roger Martin and A.G. Lafley, who define it like where are you going to play and how are you going to win there. Again, very clear choices. And so I think that's the biggest challenge most organizations and teams and leaders have is making those choices. And so they end up not focusing their business. They end up not saying no to anything. They don't make any hard choices. And they end up trying to be everything for everyone. And as we all know, when you try to do that, you kind of end up with crappy products that don't actually solve the customer problems, don't retain those customers, and your customers find someone who can do it better.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I love that Lafley point about focusing on and getting really clear on where you're not going to
Yes.
excel. And all those great examples in his book of, IKEA got really clear on what really didn't want to be good at. And one of the American airlines that I've forgotten exactly the same when they kind of pioneered the budget airline model. So yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah. And that's a fantastic tool, right? I think not enough of us articulate that. Like we can come up with a crisp strategy statement sometimes, but it's actually even better when you then come up with the anti-pattern of that or the anti-strategy, right? It's like, what are you explicitly not doing? What markets are you not going into? What are you going to ignore? What customers are you happy to piss off in order to really serve the ones you want to go after better? Things like that. It can really help people understand what you're focused on and how to make those trade-offs.
Yes, yeah, completely. There's kind of a tension in strategy making, particularly with the feeling that AI is making everything much more urgent and much more kind of panicked for people. And I would say pretty much every product leader I know is caught in the same trap where their boss or their board wants the numbers to be going up next quarter, but the right product decision might take 6, 12, maybe even 18 months to pay off. The decision stack gives you a really nice model for kind of tying all the way through from principles to strategy to kind of action. But when you've got that pressure on, how do you protect the kind of strategic bets from getting sacrificed to the kind of short-term pressure?
Yeah, I think, look, I understand that pressure as well, and I've faced the same pressure. I think it comes back to that bet language to some extent of like really being clear about what we're making as bets, what our hypothesis is. And then it really comes down to communication for me, right? I think the more that we can lay out, we're making this investment upfront, like we might actually be happy to, and this can be that strategic trade-off, right? We're actually happy to trade off short-term win on conversion because we're making this big bet that we think is ultimately going to deliver much more, and then showing the work along the way, right? I think so often we wait for those 18 months and then kind of hope and pray that we hit the number. But if we can along the way show that, oh, well, here's the assumptions that we've unpacked, here's the research we've done to back that up, then we've done, some MVP or some prototyping or some testing, and that's given us early indicators that we're heading the right way. What are the early, leading indicators as opposed to the final revenue? Those kind of conversations, I think, really build that safety for you. And then fundamentally, I think the biggest challenge is to make sure that you're actually not trying to compare, this massive big bet that you have with a tiny feature right in front of you. Because if you're trying to compare apples and oranges, you're never really going to succeed. And really to elevate the conversation instead, to make it about investment, right? To use some of that kind of board language or governance language around, well, we're making an investment. We're going to invest 80% of our time in this big bet. Here's what we think that payoff's going to be. It is an 18-month payoff, versus we're going to spend 20% on kind of keeping the lights on and making sure nothing falls over in the meantime. And that lets you and your leadership team have a better conversation around, okay, well, how do we actually want to do those resources? Is it 80-20? Maybe it's 60-40 because we want to try hit some numbers, or at least not, make the numbers worse in the meantime. That's a different conversation than like, big bet A versus small feature C, right? That's a very tough conversation to have.
Yeah, got it. That's really helpful. On principles, that we touched on them a little bit earlier, but it feels like one of the key unlocks for getting the kind of linkage right through the stack. Can you give me an example of a company where you've seen kind of genuinely really good principles and not just the ones that go on the wall and get forgotten?
Yeah. And, I crap on them every once in a while, but I do think values have their place, and we should have these conversations as teams about what we, how do we want to work? What's important to us? What do we value? But then I think the good principles take that an extra step and really think about, how do we articulate this as a decision, right? As a trade-off. So a good example is, a lot of organizations out there have some kind of value about excellence up there on their wall, but that doesn't really help anyone. We're like, how do we define that? What does that mean to us? And so Google's a good example. They have a principle around fast is better than slow. So they really want to emphasize, like, what does excellence mean to us? It's speed, right? And you see that through almost every single one of their products, right? They obsess about loading times. They obsess about how quickly the search result comes back. So speed is one of the ways that they define that excellence value. So I think it's when you can see those changes that it really makes a difference. I think just looking at, Mind the Product, when we built our conference, we kind of had a principle about putting the attendee experience first. And again, you can see that in the decisions that we made. So we were always, most of our revenue came from ticket sales. So we could put that emphasis on the attendee experience. We could make sure that the speakers were the best possible. We could build amazing, experiences around the conference. And we could make that trade-off that meant the sponsors maybe wouldn't be quite as happy and they didn't get as much space or attention as they might at other conferences. And that was a strategic trade-off that we were willing to make. Other conferences make different choices. It also highlights that there's not necessarily a right or wrong, but there is the importance of kind of making a choice over not making a choice, at least.
Love it. Great. Okay, so zooming out to the whole stack, if I'm a product leader at a FTSE 100 company and I realize my decision stack is broken or that the linkages aren't there, where do I start and what happens on day one, other than calling you?
Well, I do want to emphasize, I don't want the decision stack to say that, you have to throw everything out and start all over, because that's not the answer. And it's definitely not, let's do another strategy day and go to an offsite and kind of build a new thing in an ivory tower. But I think step one's really an honest assessment of what you already have. Like, what are the pieces that are in place? What's working and not working for you? How do they connect and not connect? Again, my favorite hack is just literally to go ask your team, right? Like, can you articulate the strategy? Like, why are we doing this thing? And that'll very quickly show you like where those pieces are missing or unclear, right? And again, most organizations have some form of strategy. It might even be a good strategy, but if it's not communicated, it's not helping anyone make decisions either. So it's really assessing those parts of it and then figuring out what's most broken and starting to solve that, and really treating it as a living, breathing thing where you're iterating on it constantly. It's not, again, a set and forget tool. It's not something that you're going to do once a year. It's something that should be there as a tool for the whole team going forward. So yeah, assess what you have, kind of find where those gaps are, fill in the gaps. You might realize that one of those elements is broken, like maybe your OKR process isn't as good as it could be, or it doesn't connect to your strategy, or maybe your strategy isn't as bold as it should be. And then that's a conversation to start elevating, right? So if you're senior enough to bring that across your organization, then you should do that. If you're more in the middle of that stack and you're kind of frustrated that you don't have the clarity you need, help them, right? Figure out, use your product and design and engineering superpowers to figure out what should that strategy look like. What are the insights that we've gotten from the market lately? What are the trade-offs that we've had to make? how can we articulate that better, and almost use that as a straw man then to start the conversation with your leaders and your leadership, and ask them, like, is this the right direction? Is this like how I should interpret this? And even if they kind of come back at you and go, no, no, that's not at all right, at least you started the conversation and you can kind of get to a better place. But I think the worst thing you can do is just kind of just accept that your strategy isn't working and then wait for someone else to solve the problem, right? I think we all have to be empowered to challenge those statements and challenge those strategies, and ask for better guidance, basically.
Yeah, fascinating. I know you've written about it a bit, but I love the Richard Rummel kernel of a strategy, and obviously one of those three pieces that he talks about is the diagnosis. And I
Yeah.
always in my head thought the diagnosis is a thing you do and then you move on, but actually it sounds like from what you're saying the diagnosis is continuous, or at least it
Yeah.
needs to be close to continuous now, because so much is changing. You can't wait until the next quarter or the next year to kind of have an eye on that diagnosis.
Absolutely. And I think it's also recognizing that these things live on different timescales, right? So if you are a startup, your strategy is probably only as long as your next funding round, right? Like your runway, because you have to prove a big bet before you can go raise more money. If you're a more established company, if you're in that FTSE 100, it's probably a longer window, it's 3 to 5 years, but you have to constantly be reassessing and questioning it. Because at any point, you invalidate an assumption, then you have to start the strategy over from scratch at that point. You can't wait 3 years until the end of the cycle. And so I think it's the more that we treat it as a living thing, and the more we treat it as something we're always checking in on. And again, that cadence can be different. In a startup, I like a kind of 6 week cadence of checking back in on these things. If you're in a more corporate or well-established environment, maybe it's once a quarter at least, to do that check-in, right? And it's not, again, about replacing what you already have. It's not like, oh, we need a strategy check-in and adding more meetings to our time. It's actually just how do we bake these things into things that we already have, whether it's an OKR review or quarterly planning or something like that, where we actually just connect the dots and make sure that we're still headed in the right direction before we make those choices. So I think it's just remembering that it's a living document is one of the most important things that we can do, and not treat it as this like static PDF that we put on a shelf and forget about, right?
Yeah, 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 right. The things you've talked about actually apply to leaders across organizations, but I'm interested in what are the implications for product managers, because the discipline feels like it's changing and like there will be even more change over the next few years. What advice that was great in 2015 is now actively harmful?
Probably depends who you were listening to in 2015, right? I think, I think that was a tough one. I think it's probably just more of the same. I think we were probably saying this about 10 years ago, but I think we just need to spend even more time on strategy and on differentiation. And I think that comes from better discovery and better research. And I think, again, we've been talking about this, but I think the product world moves in waves. It's probably not one monolith kind of all walking in lockstep, right? So not everyone's kind of caught up with this, but the more we're doing discovery, the more we're doing research, the more we understand our customers in the market, the better answers we'll have. And that, I think, will enable us to build better strategy. So I think that's probably my biggest one, especially in a world where delivery is just going to get faster and faster with AI. We can build more things, but we still have to make sure we're building the right thing in the first place.
Yeah, right. And casting forward 10 years, do you think the role will still exist in its current form?
Again, I think that's a definitional question to some extent, right? Because it looked very different 10 years ago. It looked very different 20 years ago to what we see today. So I think there's always going to be a role for product. I think there's some question of like, is that a hybrid role? Is it more than one people? But the core job will always remain, right? To quote Marty Kagan, right? Uncovering that which is usable, valuable, viable, and feasible. Someone has to do that work, right? And maybe AI will lead to a world where that can be a hybrid role. I still think that there's going to be a huge amount of value that experienced craftspeople in product can bring. And so I'm still hopeful for the role, and I'm still optimistic for what there is ahead. I think there's just going to be more challenges and more interesting challenges for us to figure out. And there's going to be more opportunity. I think previewing a little bit of the talk at Weave, right? I would like us to have a bit more of an abundance mindset. Like, what could we do with more that isn't a threat, that actually opens up more opportunities, more possibilities? And I think the more we come at it that way, the more opportunities we'll find, basically.
Brilliant. Yes, there'll be lots of relieved product managers out there who, will be pleased to hear there'll still be a role in 10 years. The thing we're definitely seeing is product managers who are becoming sort of even more cross-functional, and some of
Yeah.
them exploring engineering, some of them exploring design, and that's an amazing skill, right? Because they gain this greater appreciation for the sort of end-to-end life cycle. Great. That is super exciting, and I can't wait to hear you talk about the decision stack at Weave. Before I let you go, I want to do some rapid fire questions. So, in a few words, what's the best product you've seen built in the last year?
I've seen a lot of new cool stuff, but I think thinking just about my adoption curve as well, I would have to say granola. I really love granola for my meetings. I track every meeting now, even face to face, kind of one-on-ones with granola. And it's just one of those things I think that shows two things for me. One, it's a startup based here in London, so it shows that we can build amazing tech out of Europe as well. And two, I think it just shows what good UX can look like in an AI world where it's almost seamless and invisible, and it's just there, and it kind of knows when my meeting started and prompts me, and then it's recording, and it gives me great notes, and it kind of gets out of the way. So I really love granola, and I'm a big fan.
Me too. Our whole team are using it. Number two, worst trend in product management right now.
I think this one's maybe coming to an end now, but we definitely saw a lot of this last year, which was just slapping AI on everything, right? The little sparkly icon showed up everywhere, chat interfaces showed up everywhere. And look, I get it. We get pressure from external, whether stakeholders or investors or boards to like, oh, what are we doing about AI? And we have to show some progress sometimes. And some of those were hugely useful, but a lot of them were just, face value and just kind of slapping it on there. So I'm hoping that trend is finally over. It looks like it's dying out, but I think it's kind of the knee-jerk reaction to any new technology is usually the wrong one.
Agreed. Yeah, we did a slide for a presentation last year where we tried to gather all of the sparkles on products that had lasted. And, I spent half a day and I found hundreds of them. It's
Yeah,
amazing. And they've all gone away
yeah,
now.
yeah.
Uh, Number three, one book every product leader should read, and you can't say yours.
I will have to say two. So I think a perennial that is still underappreciated and underdiscovered, sadly, is Continuous Product Discovery Habits by Teresa Torres. I think all product teams, leaders, people need to be better at discovery, and that's definitely the best book on that. I think the other one would be my favorite from the last kind of year or two, which is Impact First Product Teams by Matt Lemay, which kind of takes that to the next level of like, how do we get all our teams really focused on impact, right? I think as an industry, we've been a little lax on that front and kind of forgotten the business part of that Venn diagram and been too focused on the UX and tech side. And so we have to remember to bring the business in and bring value along with us along the way.
Yes, yeah, super interesting. Okay, number four, finish this sentence. Most product teams fail because.
They don't make tough choices. So going back to that poor strategy conversation we've been having, I think.
Great, love it. Number five, what company would you love to advise, but you haven't yet?
I think that's a good one. I've been lucky to advise a couple of AI first startups here in London, but I would love to be on a fly on the wall on something like Lovable or Claude to really see, those massive hyperscaling AI first startups. Partly because I think they're doing amazing, interesting products, but also because they're just changing the way we do it, right? They're really fundamentally rethinking how product development works. And I think it would be fascinating to be part of that journey.
Yeah, agreed. Number six, and the final rapid fire question. What's the hot take that would get you into trouble on LinkedIn?
I mean, probably many. I think right now I'm thinking a lot about this strategy question. And so I think a potentially hot take on that is I think the incumbents in our industry are both too afraid of AI, but not thinking differently enough with AI. I think they're not, going back to the stack, they're maybe looking at it at their kind of surface level, at the opportunity level. Maybe they're thinking about it as objectives, but not enough of them are kind of fundamentally going back to their strategy and questioning whether AI has changed any of those fundamental assumptions. And therefore, I think they're too short term about the impact of AI.
Great. Okay, so one last thing before we close. We've got 120 product leaders coming along to Weave in a couple of weeks. We've got speakers from Monzo and Sky and Virgin Active and some really interesting perspectives. Senior people with real problems but limited time. If they do one thing after this conversation, what should it be?
I think given that the theme is all about software abundance, I think really kind of question what is your business doing? Does your strategy have an answer for what you would do in a world where software is more abundant? And maybe bring that kind of challenge to the event so that we can have an even better conversation. I know we're going to have a lot of great talks and discussions around this, but obviously we want to engage the audience as well. So the more crystallized that kind of thought is as you come into the room, I think we'll all have better conversations.
Great. A bit of homework before the event. I love it. All right. Well, thank you very much, Martin. Really appreciate it and looking forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks.
Likewise. Thanks for having me.